situation I'm about to recall happened on Sunday the 4th of December 1966, which is 49 years ago next week. At the time I was involved in a series of sightseeing flights from Jandakot in a Royal Aero Club Cessna 206. Phil Roberts and I were taking cadets on city and beaches flights in the Royal Aero Club's new flagship, and we alternated as pilots each sortie. After all the cadets had flown, we decided to do one more trip for the benefit of the attendees who had been at Jandakot with us. So we set out the last trip with me as pilot and Phil alongside, Cadet Under Officer Jeff Binks and Phil's fiancée Isabel occupying the middle seats, and Gus Slater with girlfriend Karen Wagner in the rear seats. We flew over Perth City and then to the coast at Scarborough before tracking south towards Fremantle. It was a hot afternoon and the beaches were well populated, as were the surrounding roads. However, while enjoying the scenery on approach to the city beach, the frequency of the engine began to decrease. My first response was to ask Phil what he'd done, and he said nothing. I pushed the throttle wide open, but nothing changed, so both of us began to investigate further as I turned away from the coast. All we knew was that we'd suffered a partial loss of power for no apparent reason. I began to head for the nearest airport, Perth, and called the tower, which controlled the area frequency at that time, to tell them where I was and to advise them of our situation. I told him that we were diverting to Perth Airport. That turned out to be grossly optimistic. He asked me to confirm my intentions, but I almost immediately had to revise them and tell him that the power reduction was more serious than I'd first realised, and I was now searching for a possible forced landing site in the area just south of Perry Lake Stadium. Here, there's the vicinity. As we flew along Underwood Avenue, I glanced at the amount of traffic on the road below and decided it wasn't shaping up as a really good alternate. However, Phil then drew my attention to an area of open space appearing on his side, and that became part of our plan for the immediate future. Unbeknown to me at the time, it had once been known as West Subiaco Aerodrome. I noted that the sea breeze was blowing quite strongly, so I needed to land either into the south or the west. As I passed on the south side of the field, I saw that we were at about 800 feet, and landing into the west would be preferable simply because of the greater dimensions of the field in that direction. There were actually two fields orientated this way, but the other was significantly shorter and about 3 metres lower. Unfortunately, I then saw that there were also several lines of fixed reticulation pipes lying directly across the preferred runway. I was unwilling to put my wheels among them because I figured they'd trip us over. A second possibility was to extend further east and then back tightly over the adjacent sewage farm to get into the upper field. Thoughts were already of being in the shit were blocked out. To make use of this alternative path, I would need to come in low over the sewage plant and then brake heavily after touchdown before reaching the pipes. Unfortunately, any hopes of doing that were dashed when I saw that the sewage plant included a number of tall vents, too high to overfly and too close to weave between. Another plan had to be discarded, but then life wasn't meant to be easy. That's one of Malcolm's phrases. The alternatives were beginning to evaporate, so I decided to land into the south. To do so, I would initially turn north towards Perry Lake Stadium and then make a left turn for an approach into the south. First required me getting around the CSIRO building on the corner of Underwood Avenue, whose rooftop was getting much closer. That particular thing that you see there is the field as it looked that day, excepting it wasn't all in black and white. That's the McGillivray Oval as it was then known. It's now called the University of WA Sports something or other. Sports ground. And that yellow dot around there, just gratuitously, was the old Brooklands racing track, which you may have heard of, but none of us would have seen. The alternative was beginning to evaporate, so I decided to land into the south. And to do so, I'd initially turn towards the Perry Lake Stadium, as I said, and come around the CSIRO building on Underwood Avenue, whose rooftop was getting much closer. On coming out of the turn, we headed into that part of the field on which I intended to land. Unfortunately, its length was now obviously too short, and I would need to steer between the looming change rooms and pump house. McGillivray Road ran across the northern end of the field and was unfortunately lined with an avenue of trees. I recognised that we must first get over them before descending into the field. After that, I'd be able to lower the flaps, slow down and increase my angle of descent. Within seconds, Phil warned me that there were power lines on the other side of that road. This changed things, making it immediately apparent I couldn't lower any flap before passing over them. The situation was becoming decidedly uncomfortable. I narrowly slipped over the power lines and immediately called for the flaps. The angle of descent increased, but we were still fast. I soon began to flare, and while turning left to avoid the approaching building, inexplicably, the nose then seemed to suddenly pitch down. Phil exclaimed, "Oh no," or words to that effect, and I realised that he and I were thinking alike. We must have stalled. Flying into the ground was now both inevitable and imminent. Then a light bulb moment occurred. My mind suddenly went back to a fortnight before, when I'd gone to Muliabini, where the flagship of the University Flying Club had come to grief. The UFC president, Ian Dundas, had tried to land there in a strong crosswind, and in going around he was unable to prevent his aircraft from drifting. The wingtip struck a tree branch just as he became airborne, and the aircraft turned through 180 degrees as it dived back to the ground. The impact broke the engine sideways, and as it tore off, it lost almost all its kinetic energy. Ian scrambled out unhurt, when logic would have suggested that he'd be sitting in the cockpit with an engine in his lap. Now I had a plan. Just before impact, I must yaw left and break off the engine so it didn't enter the cockpit. I went immediately to the last line of the crash briefing. "Hang on!" Phil had been briefing the other passengers for arrival, but neither he nor I had the opportunity to brace ourselves. In my case, it was because of the need to keep flying the plane until it stopped. In his case, he just seemed to have a desire to attack the instrument panel with his head. These needs were foisted upon us because the aircraft was only fitted with lap belts. Thus, there was no restraint for our torsos. My first impact was with the control column and then continued on into the instrument panel. The aircraft's arrival was rather noisy, and as it came to a halt, I pushed myself back from a close examination of the radio stack and thought, well, it didn't hurt too much. However, I was rather confused about the scene ahead of me. It was all green. If I had been able to observe the aircraft from outside at that moment, I would have seen that it was poised vertically on its nose and I was looking at the grass. However, the ride wasn't over yet. As the aircraft fell over onto its back, I was given another opportunity to ram my head into the instruments. At this time, I told whoever was listening to my brain, "I'm sorry, it really does hurt." The audio switches across the top of the panel ran lines through my hair. Later, I mused that this was possibly the reason that this part of the panel is called the combing. I again extracted myself from among the instruments and yelled to everyone to get out. I undid my seatbelt, dropped to the roof, and then tried to open the door. I moved the handle in the wrong direction before I remembered that we were inverted. Moving it the other way proved to be far more effective. Phil was no help because he chose that moment to be upside down and asleep. I crawled out on the wing and then ran around to the other side to open the rear door before again remembering that it was inverted, not reversed. When I opened it, I was greeted by Gus, who's in the room today, probably still not wishing to remember this. When I opened it and greeted Gus, he gave me a very firm, "Don't touch me." He later told me that he had recoiled because of the sight of two white eyeballs looking at him from a sea of red. Almost immediately, Karen shot out between my knees and disappeared. I ignored Gus's orders and undid the seatbelt, allowing him to free fall to the roof. I then went to where I had last seen Phil. As I arrived, he was leaving through the opposite door. That accounted for everyone, so I told people to go down the slope and away from the aircraft in case it caught fire. Everyone seemed happy to do that. I also suggested they sit down just in case anyone, particularly me, felt faint. A member of the public came up to tell me he'd seen it all and offered to be an eyewitness. I thanked him and assured him we'd seen it too. I then lay down again to bleed more comfortably. The first person to appear on the scene was a reporter from the West Australian. 10 minutes earlier, he'd been at the Shenton Park fire station inquiring whether there were any fires to report on such a hot day. Before he had a chance to get an answer, the alarm sounded in the building and the fire truck scrambled and headed off to McGillivray Oval, where a plane had crashed. It was a sight I never had heard of prior to that day. We were soon provided with a couple of ambulances with police escorts for a trip to Royal Perth Hospital. On arrival at the hospital, Phil and I were taken into a casualty area for assessment. There was another young man on the other side of the curtain from me. He was being asked questions like, "Can you feel this? Can you feel that?" Later, the doctor treating me said that we'd got off lightly. That young man had dived into the water at Cottesloe that afternoon and hit his head on a rock. He was now a paraplegic. After a time, we were moved to a ward and were allocated beds about 6 apart. The distance was very inconvenient because Phil and I needed to talk. Both of us were concerned because neither could understand how an aircraft with enough speed to be controllable and no stall symptoms present would suddenly pitch nose down. I struggled with that all night until I saw a picture on the front page of the newspaper the next morning. That's the one, thanks Brian. We'd suffered an optical illusion. The fact was that the aircraft didn't pitch down. The ground pitched up. We were on an embankment. I had deliberately performed a controlled crash, thinking only to break off the engine. Many times over later years, I pictured myself savagely raising the nose during the flare and landing onto the upsloping embankment before halting near the change rooms. Of the 6 people on board, 4 were injured. Phil and I had lacerations from impact with the instrument panel. His were more serious than mine because he'd also been knocked unconscious. Mine were mainly head lacerations, but I also had a bruised sternum from the control column. The worst injuries were received by Isabel and Jeff, whose spines were stretched at the climax of the somersault. Gus and Karen were able to escape unscathed, and providing he's still with us, yes, he's still in the room, and Gus is still unscathed. The night in hospital was surreal. Phil and I were both high on adrenaline and had accidentally become some sort of celebrities. In the hospital that night, word got around about our presence, and we were subsequently visited by almost every nurse we knew. Some weren't even on duty. Finally, a sister came and shooed them away. The next morning, my first visitor was a crash investigator from the Department of Civil Aviation. He dangled an important piece of evidence in his hand. It was the throttle cable that he had extracted from the wreck. It had broken at a ball joint where it should have been connected to the engine. Consequently, I was deprived of any further control over the engine, which gradually had gone to the idle position. However, he also showed me a DCA airworthiness directive for the owners of Cessna 206s. It included a picture that had been sent to all owners of such aircraft, warning them that the throttle linkage should be replaced promptly. There was a strong possibility that it would otherwise snap at the ball joint. That directive had been issued in June and it was now December. I was interviewed by a DCA man from Melbourne. He wanted me to account for the accident, but he said he wouldn't give his opinions on how I should have handled the landing. He then proceeded to do so, saying I should have landed across the sprinkler lines because they were on the longest part of the field and they weren't heavy. That was news to me. They were dark brown in colour and I took them to be made of rusty iron. Even if they weren't heavy, I don't think I would have deliberately ventured at speed into them. The following day, the stream of visitors to hospital was so continuous that we were rationed by the nursing staff. They included large numbers of friends and relatives, but at one stage there were 30 people around our 2 beds. A nursing sister kept shooing them away, but they just wandered off the other bed and returned as soon as she turned her back. At that stage, I was single and still playing the field. Therefore, there was potential for embarrassment, and so it transpired. At one stage of the day, 3 young ladies came in independently and in quick succession. Unfortunately, I was dating all of them, something of which they were not individually aware. My brother revelled in my discomfort. He believed I was getting my comeuppance for being greedy. Another photo appeared in the Daily News on Monday afternoon. The sight of wounded warriors seemed to awake all sorts of maternal instincts in some of the visitors. On Tuesday, I spent most of my time marking junior certificate science papers, even though I was now on sick leave. I was joined in that task by the latest of my girlfriends. She and I had dated for the very first time the night before the crash. I'm happy to say she's still with me 49 years later. On Wednesday morning, I was frustrated by being trapped in hospital and requested discharge. Finally, it was conceded that I hadn't been concussed and there was no reason for me to stay. I couldn't get out fast enough. Phil was in hospital for several more days, and Isabel and Jeff even longer. Fortunately, none of us seems to have had any lasting issues arising from our escapade. However, one thing that disturbed me was the attitude of the aircraft owners. Neither the manager nor any other Aero Club official visited us in hospital. In fact, no contact at all was made for more than a week, when the manager summoned me to Jandakot to write an account of the accident. I guess they were still in mourning over their loss. Then again, perhaps a degree of embarrassment was being felt, since failure to do mandatory maintenance was the root cause. As time went on, the issues of damages and compensation arose, and that's when Phil and I were reminded that as Aero Club members, we weren't able to take any action against the club. The fine print at the bottom of the membership application form when we joined at the age of 17 included a clause in which we indemnified the club under all circumstances. That archaic requirement had been imposed on the club by the insurance company decades before. Fortunately, those who had suffered the worst injuries eventually received some compensation. A week after the accident, I went to the aircraft graveyard at the northern end of Jandakot. It was sad to see the wreck of the Aero Club's flagship alongside that of the universities. I was a member of both clubs, but the crash of one aircraft had helped to make a crucial decision in the crash of the other. I subsequently thanked Ian for inadvertently equipping me with the knowledge I needed to survive that afternoon. Finally, a very sobering piece of information came to light some time later, when it was discovered that when the aircraft had overturned, one of the sprinkler heads had pierced the cabin roof, damaging the wing spar. Had it pierced within 1 metre to either the left or the right, it would have entered a fuel tank, and I'm doubtful that I would have been standing here. Come to think of it, you wouldn't have had either of the speakers today had that been the case. Thanks. It's got an off switch, Brian.
Brian, as you can see from that, has unearthed a picture which was possibly the first landing at West Subiaco, and that would have been back in the late 20s.